Hi everyone, this is Rosie, and today we're going to learn how to sew a square or rectangular fabric basket in any size. So let's get started. Here are a few examples of the square fabric basket. Now you can make these in any size using the worksheet that I'm going to provide for you. Here I've made a set of 3 nesting baskets. And the largest one here is approximately 7 inches wide by 7 inches deep by 3.5 inches high. On the inside of the basket, I have cut out a piece of Peltex that is the width and depth of the basket, so that would be 7 inches wide by 7 inches deep. You can see the Peltex here, and then I just fused a piece of fabric the same size on top of the Peltex. And when you insert it back into the basket, it just helps the basket keep that shape. The middle size basket is 6 inches wide by 6 inches deep by 3 inches high. And then the smaller size basket is 5 inches wide by 5 inches deep by 2.5 inches high. And here's a look at the bottom of the basket. I've done some very simple quilting on all of the exterior pieces. Now I will show you how to use the worksheet so that you can make a basket in the size that you desire. Here is the worksheet that we will use, and I will put a link to download this worksheet in the description below the video. The first thing that I want you to take a look at is this little diagram right here. This shows what these measurements represent. So you have the width right here. This would be the depth of the basket, and this is the height of the basket. If we take a look at one of the baskets that I've already made, this would be the width of the basket. The side of the basket is going to be your depth, and here's the side seam right here, and then this measurement will be your height. Now this worksheet may look a little confusing, but it's really very simple, and I'm going to show you how to use it. The first thing that you want to do is decide the width, height, and depth of your basket. And the basket in the video will be 5 inches wide by 2.5 inches high by 5 inches deep. So right up here I have my desired measurements. So I'm going to write in here 5 inches for my width, 2.5 inches for my height, and 5 inches for the depth. Now you have this diagram here, and this diagram is not going to be to scale or to size or anything like that. It's just a diagram to help you determine your measurements. This section right here is for your seam allowance, and you have a seam allowance on both sides. There's no seam allowance on the top or the bottom. So for my seam allowance, I want to have a seam allowance of 1/2 of an inch, so I'm just going to write in 0.5 on both sides here. On each side of the diagram, you're going to see a box. There's one here and one here. These boxes represent the side of the fabric basket or the depth of the fabric basket. To determine the measurement for these boxes, you're going to take the depth of your basket divided by 2. So our depth is 5 inches, so each one of these boxes needs to be 2.5 inches wide. Then in the center of the diagram, you're going to see this box here. This box represents the front and back of your basket. The measurement for this box should be the width of your basket, which is 5 inches wide. So I'm going to write a 5 right here. Once you have these measurements filled in, you're going to add them up, and that is going to be your total cutting width. So if I add all these up, they add up to 11 inches. And I can add the 11 inches in the box marked total width. Now I need to determine how high I need to cut out my fabric. So in this first box right here, this measurement is going to be the height of the basket. So I'm going to write in 2.5. The middle box right here represents the bottom of the basket. So I just want to put in how deep is my basket, and that's 5 inches. And then down here we're going to write in the height again, so that's 2.5 inches. And if I add these numbers up, I get 10 inches. And again, I'm going to write that number in the box that says total height. Now that we have these two measurements, we can go ahead and fill in the information for cutting our fabric. So for my exterior fabric, I need to cut one piece that is 11 inches wide by 10 inches high. For my foam interfacing, I also need to cut out one piece of fabric that's 11 inches wide by 10 inches high. Then for my lining, I want to cut out my lining fabric 11 inches wide, but for the height, I want to take this height and add 1.5 inches because the basket has a faux binding on it. So in order to get this faux binding, we need to add 1.5 inches to the height. So my height is 10 inches, so I need to add 1.5 inches, so that makes it 11.5 inches. Now I want to point out, if you're going to quilt your exterior and foam pieces together, you want to start out with cutting measurements that are a little bit larger than what you have here. I like to add 1 inch to the width and 1 inch to the height. So I would be cutting both my exterior fabric and my foam pieces 12 inches wide by 11 inches high. Then after you're done with your quilting, you would go ahead and cut the finished quilted piece to the sizes that we have here. Our pieces will be cut out as a square or rectangle. Then we will do our quilting, and after quilting we need to cut out 2 more areas. So this is one of them right here, and this is the other one. So now we need to determine what the measurement is for cutting out these side sections. Over here I have some calculations that will help us determine the width and the height of those side center rectangles that we need to cut out. So for the width, you're going to take the depth divided by 2, and again the depth is 5 inches divided by 2, so that's 2.5 inches wide. And then for height, you want to take the depth minus 2 times the seam allowance. So the depth is 5 inches, so it's going to be 5 minus 2 times the seam allowance, so 0.5 times 2 equals 1, so that's 4 inches high. So each one of these side pieces need to be cut out 2.5 inches wide by 4 inches high. But once we start sewing the basket together, I will show you an easier way to come up with those numbers. Now let's take a look at what you will need to make the project. For notions, you will need a pair of scissors, a rotary cutter along with a rotary cutting mat and ruler, an erasable marking tool. Now I will be using a friction pen in my video. If you use one of these, you always want to be careful where you use them, because while the marks will disappear with heat, they can come back with cold. You will need some wonder clips, a seam ripper, some hand sewing needles, and some all-purpose sewing thread. And this is the one I'm using here. It is from Aurifil. I will not be using fusible interfacings in this project. Instead, I'm going to use this adhesive spray. It's the 505 temporary spray. And if you do use one of these, you always want to make sure that you're using it in a well-ventilated area and read all of the warnings on the back of the bottle. If you are using fusible interfacings for your basket, then you do not need the temporary adhesive spray. I'm using 100% cotton quilting fabric for my basket. I have these 3 pieces here, which are going to make up the bottom support. It includes a piece of Peltex, a piece of Heat and Bond Ultra Hold, which is this product right here, and my piece of cotton fabric. And I will fuse the cotton fabric to the Peltex with the Heat and Bond. Now, if you're using a fusible Peltex, you don't need the Heat and Bond. This piece will be for my lining, which has already been cut to size. This piece of fabric will be used for the exterior, and then I also have my piece of foam. I will be quilting these 2 pieces together, so I've gone ahead and I've cut them out 1 inch wider and 1 inch higher than they need to be. The reason why we start out with pieces that are a little larger is because as you quilt, that fabric gets pulled in and you would end up with a size that's too small for what you need. For the foam, I'm using Annie's Soft and Stable. Whatever foam you use, you want to make sure that your foam is sandwiched in between 2 pieces of fabric. I've pulled this apart so that you can see what it looks like. This piece of fabric on each side is going to help hold your stitching in place when you do your quilting. If you didn't have this fabric here, the stitching can actually rip away from the foam. We will start by quilting the exterior fabric and the foam piece together. I've already gone ahead and applied my temporary adhesive spray so the foam is nice and sticky. And then I will just layer my exterior fabric on top of that foam. I'm just lining up my edges here. And you want to press it down and smooth everything out. I'm going to do some very simple quilting, but I do like to draw in my quilting lines. So I'll take my broken ruler here and I'm just going to draw my first line right down the center of the fabric. And then I'll space these lines out about 1 inch apart. I have all my quilting lines drawn in, and I am starting with this panel being 1 inch wider and 1 inch higher than what I need for my finished panel. Now we can go ahead and start quilting. I'm sewing on a Juki DX4000 QVP, which is also known as the Kokochi. I'm going to use a stitch length of 3.0 for my quilting. I like to start in the middle of the piece, and you do not need to backstitch. And I'm just following along my line. Then I like to go back up to the top. I always quilt in the same direction, so I'm quilting from top to bottom on each line. Then I'll go back up to the top again, but this time I will quilt on the other side of that first line. And when I quilt, I like to alternate from side to side. Go ahead and finish quilting all of your lines. I finished my quilting and now I'm ready to cut my piece to size. So if I refer to my chart, it needs to be 11 inches wide by 10 inches high. I already have it lined up on my mat, and I'm going to start by cutting the width. I'll just place my ruler down, line it up correctly, and then I'll make my first cut. Then I'll do the same thing on this side. And now I'll cut the height. So I'll line up my ruler again, and I'm going for 10 inches high. When I'm done cutting, I just go ahead and check my measurements. So I have 11 wide by 10 high. Along the width of the piece, I want to draw 2 lines. The first line will be drawn down from the top. The second one is going to be drawn up from the bottom. And the measurement for the line is equal to the height of your basket. So the height of my basket is 2.5 inches. So I'll take my ruler and measure 2.5 inches up from the bottom. And I'll turn it around and 2.5 inches from the other side. Back at the machine, we need to sew a few lines. The first two lines will be sewn 1/8 of an inch away from the edges along the width. You want to use a stitch length of 2.0, and that's going to help secure all of your quilting lines here so that they do not come out. Next, you want to sew over the lines that you drew 2.5 inches down from each of these ends. And you'll use a stitch length of 3.0. I'm going to stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the edge with a stitch length of 2.0, and you want to make sure that you catch all those lines of quilting. You don't need to back stitch. Then I'll flip this around and stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the edge on the opposite side. And now I'm going to sew along those lines that I drew 2.5 inches down from each side with a stitch length of 3.0, and I will backstitch. And then I'll go ahead and finish up sewing down the line on the other side. We need to cut out these two side sections, and earlier I said that I would show you an easy way to do this. So the first thing that we want to do is measure the width of the cut. And if we look on our chart here, it says the width is the depth divided by 2. So again, my depth is 5 inches divided by 2. I want to measure in 2.5 inches from each side. So I'm going to turn it this way because that measurement is going to be done along the height of the basket. So I'm measuring in 2.5 inches, and I'm going to mark a line, and I'm just going between the two lines of stitching that we marked 2.5 inches down from the top and the bottom. Then I'll turn this around and do the same thing on this side. Next, we need to measure the height of the cut. And earlier I said that I would show you an easier way to do this. What you want to do is take the height of your basket, which is 2.5, and add on to that your seam allowance, which is 0.5, and that gives you 3.0 inches. So what we want to do now is measure 3 inches down from the width of the basket. So I'll turn this around so that I have the width of the basket here along this side, and I'm going to measure 3 inches down from the edge along the width. And I'm going to turn this and do the same thing on the other side. If I look at my worksheet again, that cutout should measure 2.5 inches wide by 4 inches high. So you can go ahead and double check it with your ruler. And I have 2.5 inches wide by 4 inches high on each side. And now that you have your cutout marked, you can go ahead and cut it out with a pair of scissors. We're ready to sew in the lining. So I want to take my lining piece and place it wrong side facing up, and I have the 11-inch edge running in this direction. I want to measure a line 3/8 of an inch down from each of those edges. And this is my stitching line. This is always optional. You do not have to mark a new stitching line if you don't want to. Then clip the lining to the exterior. You'll clip both sides, and after clipping them together, we can go over to the machine and sew them. I have my lining and exterior clipped together, and you're going to notice that you have a lot of extra fabric. This extra fabric is needed to create your faux binding. I'm sewing the lining to the exterior with a stitch length of 3.0 and a seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch. And you do want to back stitch at both ends. And I'm actually sewing just shy of that line. That's to give me a little bit of extra room for the faux binding. And when you're done stitching that line, you'll flip it over and stitch the other side in exactly the same way. Take the piece and turn it right side out so that your lining and exterior are facing wrong sides together. And then we want to go ahead and press that in place. I have my Omni Grid cutting and pressing station here. If I open this up, it's a cutting mat on one side and it's a pressing pad on the other side. So go ahead and just give this a really good pressing. You can see the faux binding along the top and bottom edge. And now we need to cut out that side rectangular piece from the lining. And all you need to do is follow the cut that you made for the exterior. Now we'll once again turn this so that the right sides are together. And you want to have your lining side right side together and your exterior side right together. And then we're going to clip along the side edges. And as always, I like to mark in my seam allowance. So I will first mark my seam allowance in, which is going to be 1/2 of an inch. Then I can clip my sides together. And when you do this, you want to have the bottom edge of that faux binding in line with each other on each side. So line them up so it looks like this, and then clip in place. You'll clip both sides together and then we can sew them. I'm sewing the sides together with a stitch length of 3.0 and the seam allowance is 1/2 of an inch. You want to backstitch at both ends. Then you can flip this around and sew the other side in exactly the same way. After sewing the sides, press your seams open. And you'll press the seams on the other side in exactly the same way. Now we can sew the bottom corners of the exterior and the lining together. So if you take your piece and just get your fingers in right here and pull in opposite directions, it's going to bring those edges together. So this is the side of the basket, this is the bottom of the basket. And clip in place. And you'll do the same thing to the other side. Get your fingers in on these edges here and pull and clip. Now for the lining, we're only going to sew one side of the lining closed. And the reason why is because we're going to use the other side of the lining to turn the basket right side out. So over here, I have my fingers in those edges, and I'm going to pull and clip together. You do want your seam allowances to be open when you clip. And I did go ahead and mark in my seam allowance. On the exterior side, the stitching line that's right here will be my seam allowance. I'm sewing with a stitch length of 3.0 and a seam allowance of 1/2 of an inch, and you do want to backstitch at both ends. Then you can sew the other side in exactly the same way. And then you'll sew one side of the lining together. And for this, I do like to drop my stitch length down to 2.6. I like to trim down the seams on the exterior side to about 1/8 of an inch. This will help reduce bulk on the bottom of the basket. I don't trim my lining side, and now you can go ahead and turn your basket right side out. Be gentle because you don't want to rip the fabric on the lining. Push out all of your corners. And then I like to go ahead and give this a nice pressing. When you're pressing, you want to make sure that all your seams on the exterior and the lining are lying flat, and you want to make sure that your faux binding is laying nicely over the edge. Now we can close up the hole in the lining. So you want to fold it under 1/2 inch on both sides. Bring both sides together, tuck in the corner there, and put in a few clips. Do the same thing on the other side. You'll tuck in that corner and clip together. Now once you have it clipped, you can either hand sew it together or you can machine sew it. And I'm going to go ahead and sew this by machine. I'm sewing the lining closed 1/8 inch away from the edge with a stitch length of 2.6 and back stitch at both ends. I'm turning the basket so that the lining side is facing out. You want to make sure that that faux binding is falling nicely over the edge of the foam. And then we're going to clip all around the top. After clipping, we're going to stitch in the ditch right where that seam line is for the faux binding. I'm stitching in a ditch with a stitch length of 3.0, and you just want your needle to drop right down here. This is the seam line that joined the lining and the exterior together. You do want to back stitch at both ends. This next step is optional, but I think it's worth doing because it helps hold your corners nice and square. You want to find the corner of the basket where the two sides come together, and you're going to pinch those sides together straight up from the bottom corner. Then we're going to place some stitching right in the side here, and you'll be stitching right in that ditch again. Now you can either do this with a hand sewing needle or you can do it by machine. I will show you how to do it by machine, but you do need to have a zigzag stitch to do this. If not, you'll go ahead and use a sewing needle and thread. Set your machine for a basic zigzag stitch at its widest setting and drop down your feed dogs. Then you want to drop your needle down into that ditch and lower your presser foot. And now you just want to stitch back and forth a few times. And go slow. And then you'll do this to all four corners. Our last step is to create our bottom support. And as I said before, this step is optional. So I have my Peltex here, and I have my Heat and Bond, both cut to the same size, and I'm just placing the Heat and Bond onto the Peltex with the sticky side down, paper side is up. And then you just want to fuse this together according to the manufacturer's instructions. After it cools down, you'll take that release paper off of the top to expose the sticky side and place your fabric right on top of that. And then just go ahead and fuse the pieces together. Go ahead and place your support in the bottom of the basket. Check that it's fitting in properly. If you need to trim it down a little bit, that's fine too. So there you go. We're all done with our little basket. I do hope that you've enjoyed watching this video and that you've learned something new here. I also hope that you'll use the worksheet to make baskets in whatever size you desire. I want to sincerely thank everyone who has supported me by liking my videos and subscribing to my channel. If you're not already a subscriber, I would love to have you as one. I would also love to see you over at my Facebook group, which is Rosie and David Patterns. Please like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.